One of the many things that I really like about Batman the Animated Series is that the creative team went out of their way to shine the spotlight on some of Batman's lesser known foes. It would have been easy to just focus on the Joker, Catwoman and the Penguin, but instead they brought attention to lesser known characters like Two-Face, Killer Croc and Clayface. One such obscure Batman villain is the focus of today's video. In fact, this villain was specifically chosen to be featured in the show's pilot episode on Leather Wings. Let's talk about Man-Bat. Kicking things off, let's look at his comic book origins. Introduced in 1970's Detective Comics 400, we meet Kirk Langstrom, a scientist that specialises in studying bats, who is developing a bat gland formula. With the hopes of giving himself the sonar abilities of a bat. While his formula is initially successful, it has some unintended side effects, like transforming Langstrom into a giant humanoid bat. Langstrom's first few appearances in Detective Comics focus more on him trying to find a cure for himself, to revert back to Kirk Langstrom, but over time the Man-Bat personality starts to take over. Turns out Man-Bat likes who he's become. He's unique and he's powerful, and he wants to share his gift with his beloved fiancée Francine Lee, whether she wants to or not. Enter Batman, who develops an antidote for the two of them and sends them on their merry way. It's important to note that while Langstrom and Man-Bat are intended to be different personalities, they don't actually sound very different. They have the same way of speaking, and really the only difference between them is that Langstrom thinks being Man-Bat is a curse, while Man-Bat thinks it's the best thing on Earth. Once cured of their affliction, both Kirk and Francine realise what a terrible mistake they'd made and pledge to never become Man-Bat and She-Bat ever again. But of course, this being comic books, that does not last very long. These early Man-Bat appearances, especially the ones illustrated by Neil Adams, really lean into the horror genre, playing up how monstrous the Man-Bat was. I particularly love this splash page taken from Langstrom's wedding, with Batman pulling off Kirk's mask, revealing the Man-Bat's frightening visage. These stories were written during the post-Batman 66 era, where the comic book writers were desperate to disassociate themselves from the campy antics of Adam West and chums. However, through the course of the 70s, Man-Bat became defanged and less of a horror character. At one point, Man-Bat even had his own limited series written by Jerry Spider Conway and Marty Pasco, who would go on to become one of the story editors on BTAS, and illustrated by Spider-Man co-creator Steve Ditko, just look at Ditko's Batman, and Pablo Marcos. In this story, the Langstroms moved to Chicago, primarily to get away from Batman, but also return to their roots and start over. Trouble seemed to follow them wherever they went, and they became ensnared by a mystic named Baron Time, and even got into a fight with the Ten-Eyed Man, another obscure Batman villain. Eventually, the Langstroms moved back to Gotham, where Man-Bat became a recurring member of the Bat family and got a job as a private detective. Right. If you couldn't tell, I was not exactly enamoured by the development of Man-Bat's character during this period. The next significant Man-Bat comic would come from 1989's Secret Origin 39, where Man-Bat's origin was retold by writer Jan Stranad and Kevin Nolan. Keep Kevin's name in mind, because I'll be coming back to him shortly. This story added a few extra details, like Kirk Langstrom getting lost in a cave system as a child, and having him inserted into Batman's backstory. Young Kirk Langstrom had been at the same cinema as the Waynes on that fateful night, and the bat that smashed through Bruce Wayne's window, inspiring him to become Batman, was one of Langstrom's escaped lab animals. Now, I don't think these 2 points were ever really mentioned again, so I think it's safe to disregard them. One really cool thing they added to the story is the fact that Man-Bat became more bestial as the formula took hold. At the start of the story, we see Langstrom desperately trying to track down the ingredients to revert his condition. But when Batman accidentally breaks the last remaining vial of an essential component, we see Langstrom fade away and the Man-Bat emerge. This is the first time that we really see the bestial version of the character, foaming at the mouth. Now, the reason I bring this story up is because when Bruce Timm and his team started working on BTAS, he recalled seeing this issue of Secret Origin and finding Kevin Nolan's depiction of Man-Bat really striking. This led to Bruce tracking Kevin down and asking him to do some preliminary character models, one of which was the Man-Bat. You can see from Nolan's early designs that his Man-Bat has more emphasis on man than it does bat, which wasn't quite what we got in the final product, but it's an essential starting point for the creation of the BTAS Man-Bat. I believe that the following character designs have never been publicly shown before, so thanks to BTAS character designer, storyboard artist, director and all-round nice guy, Dan Riba, for sharing them with me. These drawings were done in January of 1991, and we can see the continued evolution of Man-Bat's design. Notice that he has a much more pronounced hump, and that his wings have now joined onto his hands. Also note that his eyes have pupils. Now in some way I find the design with pupils more frightening because it humanises him, making him seem like less of an animal and more like an evil person, which may very well be why they opted to remove the pupils, to make him seem more bestial. There's also the fact that Man-Bat is intended to be mistaken for Batman, and Batman's mask does not show his pupils, so it could just be that simple. In terms of his character, the BTAS version is massively stripped down. Langstrom doesn't want to become a hero like Batman. He doesn't want to study bats for the betterment of humanity. He just thinks bats are cool. He enjoys letting himself go. The BTAS version of Man-Bat is pure id. He's who we all are when you strip away our basic civility and niceties. He's who we are if we were to stop holding back for fear of reprisals. He doesn't have any noble purpose like curing deafness, as some later versions of the character strove to do. All he cares about is his own selfish gratification. He has blank, demonic eyes and is completely incapable of speech. All he can do is roar and screech. Langstrom's transformation fills him with ecstasy. The Man-Bat lives inside of him. If you've ever been blackout drunk when your mind just switches off, but your body is still functioning, walking and talking, that's who Man-Bat is. The person that exists when you aren't there. Langstrom wants to fade away into oblivion and let the Man-Bat take control. There are unmissable parallels to be made with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and actually the same can be said of Bruce Wayne and Batman. The idea of who we are publicly being very different from who we are deep inside is a recurring theme in the Batman universe. Although in this case I'd argue that it's also quite a sophisticated representation of addiction and the mindset of addicts, especially for a kids' cartoon in the 90s. The thing I find most interesting is the way Langstrom's family, his wife Francine and her father Dr. Marsh, act around him. When Batman visits their lab with a recording of Man-Bat's screech and a sample of fur, Dr. Marsh dismisses the recording as regular brown bats fighting with a starling, even though it demonstrably isn't. Similarly, Francine had to know what Kirk was doing, but her reaction upon seeing the Man-Bat mid-fight with Batman tells us that she probably hadn't seen him in this state before. It's almost like she knew what he was doing, but so long as she didn't have to see it, it wasn't real. Her shocked reaction, coupled with a hint of disgust, fills Man-Bat with shame and he flees with Batman in tow. This tells us that there's just enough of Kirk still left in there that he would care about what Francine thinks. The subsequent chase sequence through the Gotham City skyline is one of the most visually stunning sequences in the entire series, and it's crazy to think that this was entirely hand-drawn because it practically looks 3D. One of the reasons it looks so good is that the animation studio, Spectrum Animation, went the extra mile by including a few more frames than they were asked for, to ensure that the movement looked smooth. These extra steps, like airbrushing a layer of frost on Mr. Freeze's helmet every time he appeared, essentially adding more work but for the same amount of money, ultimately led to the studio going bankrupt. Another fun bit of trivia is that this episode used the entire series' blood budget in one scene towards the end, where Man-Bat and Batman crash into a sign. Seeing Batman dripping with blood, clearly scuffed up, shows the consequences of his actions, which allowed the scene to get past the censors. But that was it when it came to blood. Man-Bat technically only appears in one episode, but the Langstroms make their return in Terror in the Sky. In this episode, Kirk is seen to be in recovery, but fears that he may be uncontrollably transforming back into the Man-Bat. No one believes him that it isn't intentional, not Batman and certainly not his wife Francine, and so she leaves him. This episode showcases how destructive substance addiction can be. It can ruin relationships and spread through families. It's the lack of trust between the couple that results in the heartbreak for the two of them. Now the twist here is that the Bat creature isn't Man-Bat at all, it's Francine who's turning into the She-Bat, following an accidental spillage of the Man-Bat formula in Dr. Long's lab. The irony here is that Francine has no idea that she's been infected, and that her father's selfish and clumsy actions led to the beast inside of Francine awakening. Now there's a not so subtle psychological message on the damage that parents can inflict on their children. These aren't subtle metaphors for mental health problems or addiction, but I really enjoy them. Compare BTAS to other cartoons at the time with a message. Think of He-Man talking directly to the audience, warning them of the danger of taking candy from strangers, and I think you'll agree that BTAS's method of teaching lessons is far more preferable. The only other DCAU appearance of the Man-Bat comes in the tie-in comics. In Batman Adventures 11, Langstrom is framed by a jealous rival. There's one sequence from this issue that really highlights Kirk Langstrom's struggle, as he talks about the temptation to use the formula again, and being intoxicated by its power. In issue 21, Langstrom is unwittingly exposed to a new Man-Bat formula created by Dr. Emil Dorian in a fun issue that has all of the Beast characters, Man-Bat, Tigress and Tony Romulus the Wolfman, battling it out. The issue ends with Dorian's lab engulfed in flames and, presumably, their deaths. However, much later in the next series, The Adventures of Batman and Robin, issue 11, Man-Bat is discovered to be alive and well, hiding away in the Batcave, and he can now talk thanks to Dorian's updated formula. At this point, all he wants to do is be left alone, and Batman obliges. Man-Bat isn't seen again until Gotham Adventures 18, which is set during the new Batman Adventures era. Now, this issue seems to contradict Man-Bat's last couple of appearances by having Kirk and Francine living at home together happily, with the Man-Bat being unleashed after Kirk was blackmailed. These kinds of contradictions are common in the tie-in comics. Having various writers working on them meant that there often wasn't a single cohesive narrative, so they're fairly easy to disregard. Having said that, they're all excellent comic books, and I recommend that you read them, even if they don't quite fit the established continuity. So in summary, I think that Man-Bat is probably one of the definitive Batman the Animated Series villains, because he completely epitomises their mission statement: to create grounded, sophisticated stories that didn't talk down to children, using overlooked characters who were distilled down to their essential elements. On Leather Wings, in particular, is the poster child for everything Batman the Animated Series tried to be. And if you're looking to get into this show, or want to share it with other people, this is a great place to start.